Good evening to you all. On behalf of RC03, I welcome Professor Vishal Jadhav for this 5-day online workshop, Academic Writing and Publication Skills. The topic of the 4th day lecture is Reflexivity in Social Science Research Writing. About Professor Vishal Jadhav. Dr. Vishal Jadhav is currently working as Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, Pondicherry University, Pondicherry. He has 18 years of teaching and research experience. His area of interest covers the field of development studies, political sociology, sociology of caste, masculinity studies, and sociology of knowledge. He has a 12 research guidance and 4 projects he has completed, and to his credit, 23 publications. Dr. Vishal Jadhav has been invited as a visiting fellow to the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex, UK, and also University of Johannesburg. He was also a coordinator for the paper EPG Padasala under HRD. He was the coordinator for the paper Classical Sociology for 20 modules and Political Sociology for 1 module. Out of 23 publications, he has published in Sage, Routledge, Orient Black Swan, and Robert publications. I am sure with his few words, his expertise certainly helped the participants to achieve the research endeavor. I request Professor Vishal Jadhav to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
For your kind words. I'll begin my presentation. Thank you so much. Dear participants, if we can put up the PowerPoint presentation. You must have had rigorous it's almost 4 days now into the workshop, and I'm sure all the other scholars have already briefed you upon how to write in social science research journals. Today, I'll be speaking on reflexivity in social science and how important it is to be reflexive in how one argues, also in how one writes in these journals, because I'm going to argue today how what we call as the social is actually a construct, and this social is embedded in power relations. So even writing, for that matter, is part of our cognitive skills. And these cognitive skills, of course, are developed through what one of the scholars calls as habitus. And therefore, part of the habitus is what we have internalized, at least the way we see the world, the worldview that we have, and how this worldview engages with our ideas, and how the outcome, of course, is in a written form, what we are actually talking about in this workshop. So there is most of these internalized ideas are, of course, from the normative system. These are structural, so to say. And when we contest these structures and these structural givens, if one were to say, we call that as, in social sciences, of course, we call that as agency. And therefore, agency and structure, as Bourdieu argues, is actually embedded within what we call as the self or the habitus. So I'll begin with the first part of this topic of the title, reflexivity. And coming to what is reflexivity, I just briefly introduced. So it is a methodology that permits an actor, a researcher, or an individual to acknowledge one's social location. So all of us are not equally socially located. We come from different backgrounds. It could be from different so-called physical spaces, but also cultural and social spaces. We also come from different time zones in terms of temporality. And therefore, the way we see, and because of our peculiar ways of socialization, what we see as the truth. So therefore, the question is, can there actually be an absolute truth? Can there actually be so-called absolute reality? Which, of course, many philosophers from Nietzsche, Heidegger, and all these people have been questioning, and so does, so do social scientists even today argue that there can never be one reality, and therefore, reality is always contested, truth is always contested, and it is in many ways related to power relations in society. So what is reflexivity? It is basically to acknowledge where one is in the social location, and how this internalization of this normative order that has become part of us through this through the process of socialization, how do we contest it? And how, because when you write something, and I'm sure you must have read about this, you must have also heard about this in the previous lectures, one has to remain neutral, so to say, quote unquote neutral, but can one actually remain completely neutral? Can this process of knowledge production be completely unbiased, is one of the questions that remains to be really answered, because at some point or the other, our subjectivities in some way or the other gets enmeshed in the what we create, in this sense what we write, either consciously or unconsciously. And therefore, the idea of reflexivity is at least to acknowledge the fact that we come from a particular social location, and when we encounter a particular social phenomena, how do we address this phenomena from where we are located? One, and how do the others actually, the people whom we are researching about, or the social world that we are researching about, how do the quote unquote the other actually see the world from their eyes? So their worldview might be completely different from how, as a researcher, our worldview is. And this, in many ways, becomes part of our writing. It becomes part of what we publish. And therefore, we need to question ourselves in terms of what are we actually writing about, and are we being truthful about it, um, in terms of how we see social reality. So reflexivity basically allows us to comprehend power relations, and power relations are everywhere in all locations. So even in terms of publication, for instance, and you would know this very soon if you are new to this, this world of publication, you would know that there are power relations in this too. So there are journals that are highly rated, but basically they have a standard set by some form of a Eurocentric episteme. So they would prefer certain kind of knowledge systems to be constructed, and would probably not allow other ideas to become part of the system. Am I audible? I'm sorry. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
Audible. I think someone just unmute.
I request the participants mute your mic.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what does reflexivity, how does it help us? So it helps us in decentering certain hegemonic ideas. It helps in deconstructing certain practices that we know about. And therefore, it tries to level the field, so to say. It tries to neutralize of course, it cannot completely do so, but at least to a great extent, it does allow us to critically look at ourselves and try and understand how and whatever we are writing, whatever we are creating in terms of our articles and research papers. How does this, allow us to distance ourselves from some kind of biasness? So it brings into notion the idea of temporality and spatiality, which is very, very important. And I'll discuss this. I'll take some time to discuss this because all social sciences are informed and are guided by the idea of rationality, the idea of logic, the idea of science, and of course, the whole idea of modernity, of course, envisages that we use the logic of rationality and science to understand everyday phenomena. But the problem with science itself is, can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, the problem with scientific method is science tries to totalize everything under it. And therefore, it sees everything in terms of binaries. It sees everything in black and white. So I'm sure, when we were doing schooling, for instance, we had biology or physics or chemistry. And in all of these subjects, if you remember and if you recollect, we had classifications, plant kingdom, animal kingdom, then the phylum, then chordata, whatever, etc., etc. And all these kinds of classifications were always in terms of opposites, of one or the other. And these were opposing in that sense. And therefore, science understands everything in terms of day and night, in terms of man and woman, in terms of every possible binary oppositions. And the problem with using this methodology in social sciences is that social sciences, our social world and our social life actually lies in the gray area. It's not in these binaries, but it's actually in between, the two binaries. And therefore, the issue, which all of us know, for instance, the contemporary, activism, especially on queer rights, for instance, talks about how the idea of gender itself has become or has been constituted in terms of these binaries of male and female, and the biological male and female, and the socially constructed man and woman, and as though there is nothing in between. And therefore, if we were to use science and scientific methodology to create knowledge within social sciences, one needs to be a little careful, and one needs to probably tweak these methods a little, so as to make them more useful for social sciences. And please remember, and if you have read about someone called Michel Foucault, you would know that the act of classification is itself an act of power. So if you were to classify something, you would actually create power relations. Just to give you an example, if I had a table full of different fruits, and if I were to say, banana is my favorite, fruit, for instance, or mango is my favorite fruit, I would actually create a vertical hierarchy in a certain sense, because I would privilege one fruit over the other. And similar kind of an exercise also goes into classification of data, classification of knowledge, classification of of constructing knowledge itself. And therefore, classification is an act of power, as Foucault says. And another issue with science is that it understands time and space as firstly as totalizing, as though nothing has ever changed. Because if you were a student of science, you would know that generally they talk about science in terms of billions and millions of years, as though, change is very slow, evolution is very slow. But in social sciences, we generally talk about it in human terms, and therefore, the sense of time in science is completely totalizing, as though nothing ever changes. It's almost as though everything is static. And space, of course, science generally talks about space in terms of something which is physical as a quantity. But in social sciences, we talk about space as symbolic. We talk about it as mental, cultural, social, etc., etc. Can we go down to the next slide, please? So this is a quote I've picked up from Pierre Bourdieu in his famous work called The Theory of Practice, where he says, and it's a very interesting quote, where he says, to restore to practice its practical truth, we must therefore reintroduce time into the theoretical representation of a practice, which, being temporally structured, is intrinsically defined by its tempo. So basically, what he is trying to tell us here is that science has a totalizing time, which does not mean anything for us as social scientists. For us, we need to use a form of time or temporality that makes sense in contemporary or in the past, or in the future, for instance. So we need to firstly use a time that has or is rooted or anchored in social reality. And secondly, of course, what generally happens is we tend to look at what has happened rather than what is happening. So he very correctly points here. He says, for the analyst, time no longer counts, not only because arriving post festum, that is after, he cannot be in any uncertainty as to what may happen, but also because he has the time to totalize, that is to overcome the effects of time. So scientific practice is detemporalized. The time is completely totalized in the sense it tends to exclude even the idea of that it excludes. Okay, can we move on to the next, please, slide? And therefore, he proposes a generative principle of practice, and which I think is very important, especially when we are even imagining the social phenomena around us. We are experiencing the social phenomena and trying to understand, trying to comprehend it. We can use these generative principles that he suggests, or the theory of practice that he suggests. And this should also, I believe, come out in the way we write, for journals or for any other serious academic exercise that we do. So what is this generative principle of practice? Basically says that we are, and this is how I began this particular lecture, that we are a product of a structure or social structures, and at the same time, simultaneously, we are also reproducing these structures. And he introduces something called the habitus. So if one were to use habitus as a concept and try and understand our own locations where we are. So imagine I'm a professor of sociology, and I'm writing a particular article. I should know from what is my vantage point from where I'm writing this, and I'll come to that. Whom am I writing for, and what am I trying to express, and what are my biases that come along, not only with my profession, but with my caste, with my religion, with my region, with my ethnicity, with everything, with my age, etc., gender. So all these are part of structure which I cannot do away with, but I can be reflexive about it. I can reflect on who I am in terms of where am I placed in the system, and why am I writing, or why am I thinking, or why am I comprehending social reality the way I see it, and why is someone else seeing it differently. I think this is very important, especially when we are doing any research, but also writing writing up for any particular journal. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does all this mean? All this reflexivity that we just discussed, what does it mean for academic writing. So firstly, when we write, and as I mentioned earlier, the world of publication is also, a place where there is a lot of politics. These are all power relations. Some journals publish some kind of, work, others don't. Some are still Eurocentric because they still believe in the idea of superiority, some kind of hegemony that they exert. Most of the journals are, of course, based on English, because it's an Anglophonic world, if one would put it this way. So there are power relations even within this, and this allows us, this reflexivity allows us now to understand the spatio-temporal context. Firstly, where are we located? So, in social sciences, we generally say we are located in the global south. But within the global south, there are, so from a central university where one is located, one could be located in a state university, one could be located elsewhere, one could be located in a Mofussil area. It does not mean that the person who is located in the Mofussil area has no views or no ideas or nothing to share or nothing to contribute to the stock of knowledge. Of course, he or she may have much more probably than most of us, in other so-called privileged places. But maybe that person's language may not allow that person to, communicate or, maybe to publish that kind of work that he or she has in so-called quote-unquote reputed journals, for instance. So one's spatial-temporal context is very important. One's location is very important, social, cultural location. Subjectivities are very important. How and what kinds of social realities exist in and around us. And of course, the notion of where power is. So power is everywhere, as Foucault has rightly pointed out, and it is definitely in the way we communicate. And please remember, when we write for a journal, when we write in terms of research articles, research papers, or even theses, for instance, we are writing certain nuances. At least we are writing about a certain truth through a certain perspective. It is not complete. There is no absolute truth, as I had begun this lecture with. What we are trying to say is, at least this is the way we see the truth, or this is the way we comprehend the truth from this particular location and given this spatio-temporal context. And there are these other power relations that coexist with this. So just to give you an example, how does this reflect in writing? So if you have read someone's work called, a very great scholar, agrarian scholar called James Scott, his famous work called The Weapons of the Weak, he begins with, there are expletives that and please remember, these are power relations, and therefore, when people cannot challenge power directly, what they do is they do so through their language. They do so through, through make-believe proverbs, for instance. They introduce new kinds of words, and there are a lot of so-called bad words, quote unquote, being used against people in power, and this in some ways allows an individual that space to contest power, if not directly, at least indirectly. And and therefore, if one were to write about certain dominated, certain hegemonized groups, say for instance, one were to write about Dalits, for instance, or let us say one were to write about blacks in America, for instance, or the Aborigines across the world, for instance. What would and how would one write this paper? Because most of these, most of the description would be in terms of narratives also. life histories, biographies, autobiographies, how would one see this life world, their life world through their eyes? And most journals, of course, would not allow for expletives to be used or for bad words, so to say, to be used in such circumstances. But if one were to show that reality, one would have to write about how and what is the worldview that the subaltern have, and how do they see the world around them, and what does it mean. So I'll give you an example of Dalit literature, for instance. If you've heard of famous um, Dalit poet called Namdev Dhasar from Maharashtra, you would know that his writings have actually, in many ways, tweaked the way, critique the way that the dominant caste groups have, or the Savarna caste groups have been writing in terms of a very um, ornamental kind of language that they use. So he's used a very unrefined, if one were to put it, quote unquote, kind of a language that does showcase the kind of resistance, the kind of power relations that are embedded in these in the relation between the Savarna and the Dalit, for instance. So how one writes also has a lot to do with power relations, and therefore the idea of using these narratives strongly. So another, of course, is the feminist methodology, and I'm sure you're all aware of this. And in feminist methodology, you would see that these are life stories and histories of women who are subordinated. Not only women, of course, feminist theories are also used by non-hegemonic um, groups of people, or the hegemonized groups of people, the marginalized groups of people. And you would see, the language is quite controversial. The language, the way the narratives are put forth, and this is done so because one has to get quote unquote the truth out in terms of the eyes of the subjugated, not from the writer's perspective, but from the perspective of how those people see their reality. And of course, there would be an argument by the author as to how he or she sees this relation in terms of power or in terms of structures, etc., etc. And another example, of course, would be social movements, for instance. So how would one write about social movements? One of the most important parts of writing about a social movement is language, and in this, in most social work done on social movements, one would see that it is always written in an active voice. It is always as though there is some agency happening at all points of time, rather than in passive language. So you would see, active form of presentation of anything that is happening. Just to give you an example of how, reflexivity is used in these forms of academic writing. And it has to do with power relations, where we are located and how we see the world around us. Next slide, please. Okay, so reflexive academic writing. Continuing that, so these are some of the questions that we're going to ask. So why are we actually even writing about something? There has to be some form of interest in bringing out or in contributing to this knowledge production. Either it is a new form of knowledge that you are presenting that has never been done before, or you're revisiting the same phenomena but looking at it from a different perspective. You're revisiting it in terms of time, in temporality, in terms of 50 years ago this was the case and today it is like this. So either in terms of time or in terms of space, a physical space, mental space, socio-cultural space. So you revisit it, relook at it, re-theorize it, and you present it. So the question is, why are you interested in, because you can't reproduce what is already there. No one would be interested to publish it. So if a publishing house needs to publish something, it will look for either new knowledge or new ways of looking at the same thing, or where you reinvent and relook at it and re-theorize particular phenomena. So caste, for instance, has been theorized multiple times, and it's still being theorized in various ways. In terms of history, in terms of now, of course, we talk about interdisciplinarity, where we look at caste through various frameworks, or gender, for instance, through various frameworks, for instance. The next question, of course, is who is this intended for? Whom are you writing this for? What is your audience? Who is your audience? And in most, and I'm sure in these 3-4 days of your workshop, you must have already the presenters must have already discussed about these issues, but I'll come back to it again. Who's the audience whom you're writing for? And then generally in academic writing, you would find that we are writing for very small proportion of people, really. People who understand, or who are in certain ways trained to understand the nuances of social sciences, the jargon of social sciences, the terms that we use in social sciences. It is not meant for common people. It is not a newspaper article. It is not it is not some commonsensical piece of work that we write. It is highly theorized, wherein we discuss power, we discuss all these issues that we just talked about, and we try and present a picture to that particular audience. So generally, whom are we writing for? Is it for the global south? Is it for the global north? Is it for certain stakeholders? So whom and who is the audience becomes very important in terms of when we talk about reflexivity. Then, of course, what is the intent of this document, or intent of this particular research paper or ideas that you present? What is it meant for? Is it for social change, or is it just to add to the stock of knowledge? Is it for some social movement? Is it for some government document? For some policy making? So what are you writing for? And that in many ways also influences what you are writing. And of course, when are you writing this in terms of, for instance, is this post-globalization, pre-globalization, pre-LPG period? Is it 1970s or 60s? So time and space, and please remember, space, is not only physical, like I mentioned, but is also mental, socio-cultural. Today, of course, we even talk about virtual space in terms of the digital age that we are talking about. So space in terms of a symbolic space, it's something that exists, which is virtual, which cannot actually be seen, or but it is there, and one can communicate, one can voice one's concerns, one can advocate on these platforms, so to say. So space is something which is quite large in that sense. And so when are we writing this also has a very important part to play. If you write something or something has been written 20 years back and something on the same topic has been written today, definitely there would be a huge difference in the theorizations that have gone into, or the perspectives that have gone into understanding the same phenomena 20 years ago and now. And of course, the other question is where is this document going? where is it going to be published? So you would actually see a lot of these subaltern groups have their own journals because, their agitations, their sufferings, their knowledge construction is not taken into account in the world of power relations, where the hegemonic let's say publishing houses would not allow for the subjugated ideas to be presented, and therefore they you would see that many of them actually crowdfund and start their own journals. And nowadays, of course, publication has become cheaper in that sense because you have online virtual spaces where one can contest these so-called dominant powers, in the field of knowledge production, gatekeepers, or if one would like to say, gatekeepers of knowledge production, where they would challenge this. And this challenge, of course, enables, it allows for, some form of criticality to come in. And of course, the last is, how would this help in knowledge production? What will one gain from it? One needs to be aware of this. So it is not, it is not some form of rational kind of behavior in terms of where you have a profit motive all the time, but it is about, it is about some form of, it is a struggle really, wherein you create knowledge, and it is not for any particular end. So it is not a means to an end, but it is to produce it because you see it and because you are passionate about it. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give an example, how does methodology that you have, and how does it actually alter or influence the way you write something? So if you have a descriptive kind of a framework for your research, and you are describing certain things, narrative, for instance, or ethnographies, you would have a different style of writing. And there are journals that would publish these kinds of writings, and they would prefer, publication of these kinds of writings. Then there are historiographical ones, which are actually questioning discourses, questioning, constructed truths. And you would find very specialized journals even for these kinds of works. So you then, of course, have exploratory or inductive, critically presenting and interpreting the available data that is there. But it is mainly inductive because there's not much review of literature to go by. So there are certain journals that would want to publish these kinds. So just to give you an example of how, it is not an equal world. Even in the world of publications, there are, you would find, for instance, for polity and economy, you would find many, many journals, but maybe, say, for instance, sexuality, or for, minority studies, there would be much lesser ones. So there are these, realities that one comes across, harsh realities, when one comes to the publication part. And of course, another example is the longitudinal studies that you might have. There are certain kinds of publications even for these kinds of methodologies that exist. Okay, so I'll end my lecture here, and I would actually welcome questions so that I can clarify many more things through this, question answer session, if there are any.
Thank you, Professor Vishal Jadhav.
Thank you so
Sir
much.
has given a very informative manner in which he has presented the technicalities, especially in writing skill, especially what is reflexivity, and he has started with, and very specifically highlighted about the power aspect, power relation aspect, and the spatial or the social location in which you are writing, and the temporary and spatiality or a social time and space he has highlighted, and the generally the science how we understand about the everything, and especially for social world or social life, how the issues are we are understanding, and how we are creating the knowledge, or classifying the power relations, and the theory of practice by Bodio presentation he has highlighted in his presentation. And coming into the generation of these principles of practice, how one should understand the phenomena. And he has very nicely put it. We are the product of the structure and reproducing the structure. That is in terms of habitus. That is really a wonderful message to the participants. And coming into the what is meant by academic writing, and what are all the issues one should be taken care of, especially the power relations and Eurocentric aspects are based on English, or you can say spatial or temporal context, or the location, especially socio-cultural context, or subjectivities, or the realities, social realities, and the power aspects. So altogether, where you located and how you have started writing. And another important aspect is also highlighted about, we are writing about certain perspective. That perspective, that is the way in which we are comprehending. So that is also another very nice ideas he has presented to the participants. Another important thing about the various perspective, about highlighted about the subaltern perspective by narratives, or Dalit literature, or feminist methodology, or social movement aspects also he has highlighted. And finally, the crucial aspect is the reflexive academic writing by way of highlighting why we want to write, or why do we research. Well, we want a new knowledge, or a production, or revisiting, or reinventing aspects. And who, what for, to whom you are writing. So these are all very, very important for us. And another thing is to understand the phenomena, that also he has highlighted in his presentation. And what are the context, or what is the intent of this document? What is meant for, whether it is for policy writing, or you want to bring about changes, or when you want to write, and where is the document is going, and how we are writing this knowledge to the production. So altogether, finally come to the methodological part, descriptive, historiographical, and explorative, and finally come into the longitudinal study. Coming to the longitudinal study, our setup, especially our society, we have very lack in doing this longitudinal study when compared with the West. They are very systematic in doing longitudinal study, and at present I found IAPS, International Institute of Population Sciences, they have conducted a study on lost data, which was the first wave they have completed in 2018. The second wave is in progress. So if we are doing that part in a different space of time, the changes which are all taking place in that particular group, no, that will be very wonderful knowledge you will get with the same respondent, with you are repeating the research with a different period of time, which will help you a lot. And based on that, the research which will be carried out. So these are all very relevant, which are all the present day context. With this, I invite the questions and Professor maybe in a question to give more guidance to.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Sir. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. This is Shruti. It is so nice to hear you after a long time.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah.
Yes, sir. My question to you is actually, I would like to reflect more on this. That, for instance, if I'm going for a participant observation, and looking exclusively to a particular community, there, if I'm following the notion of objective sociology as was given by Max Weber, and then from there, if I go on and see that how, since I'm emerging myself as a researcher there and making myself a part of them, so from there, I'm very cognitively immersed in that community and also in their daily lives and livelihood practices. So, when I and personal standpoint is something that is important, which somewhere shapes our epistemological standpoint and also the paradigm that we are choosing to go with our research. So, in formulating and actually going the transformation or the discourse that would take from my ontological standpoint to their ontological standpoint, that is the participants or the community to be studied. So here, how should I dissonate from my biases and make it more reflexive and very, from their standpoint and making it very neutral per se, if it's possible.
Okay, thank you, Seunti, for your question. And um, I think this whole process that you mentioned and you narrated, I think itself is reflexivity. Okay, so the idea that you know where you are, you're going into the field. Now, this happened with, let's say, even Malinowski, for instance, where he began with something called participant observation. So he became a part of the True Brand Islanders. Yeah, and it took him several years to actually be accepted as one of them. And for him to learn that language, for him to learn the customs, for him to understand, their life world, and from how to see the world through their eyes. So it took a long time, really. And generally, for our research, I mean, if one would really want to do a research like this, it would take years, to be very frank. Yeah, and to become part and parcel and of that so-called of that life world, of that social setting, it would take years and years. It's not something that can just occur casually. Okay, and once that happens, um, and you are aware of your own social location all the time, and you are making this distinction of knowing who you are, and you're creating a new kind of information or knowledge, you're producing knowledge, I think that itself imputes that you are reflexive. And one cannot be completely unbiased, because we are humans, and there are certain subjectivities that at some point or the other become attached to the product that we are producing. So one way or the other, it could be the choice of words that you use for your writing, for instance, because you're trained probably in a convent school, for instance. So there is a certain way that you have been trained to write, for instance, and it comes out there. Or you highlight certain facts and kind of not highlight the others of that social phenomena, for instance, because you feel they are important. Now you feel because they feel, but I think as a social researcher, one also has to use a certain general principle of neutrality, and where one uses science, where one uses rationality. So we go by all this, but at the end of the day, one cannot completely say that the work done by anyone is completely unbiased. It's not possible. Yeah.
Yes, sir. It is actually how we also shape the phenomenological understanding and adds up to the stock knowledge.
Correct.
Because in qualitative research, the researcher's bias is supposed to come, and there will be the origin of subjectivity.
It
in
is
the
there because it's a gray word. We cannot completely, we are not objects.
right,
Our research is also influencing the participants, and the participants are also influencing the research. So it's a dialectic. It's not in some static space. It's all happening at the same time. Okay, so we don't know where to draw the line and say, okay, this is the truth.
right,
Because there is no
right,
absolute truth, really.
right. Thank you so much, sir. It was very
Sure.
insightful.
Nice meeting you. Yeah, nice seeing you here. Any other questions I'd like to take, please?
Yeah. Sir, good evening.
Good evening.
I am Dunstan, Dean of Pondicherry College of Engineering, Nagarcoil, Kanyakumari district.
Nice
I am at the
meeting.
lands end of India. Let me at the outset register my appreciation for the wonderful lecture you have delivered on this. But I have now one clarification, sir.
Sure.
We have been writing, and any writing for that matter, especially in social sciences and sciences, should effect change. And as social researchers, in Dalit writings, subaltern writings, black writings, minority writings, we have been writing. But still, the male domination, the hegemony, the power relations have not given that equity to women, gender, and all those things. What do you suggest that when will this change get effected?
Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. And thank you for the appreciation. I am, I don't think we can ever have a world that is egalitarian completely. There would always be power relations. There's a very interesting work done by someone you might like to refer to called Escape from Freedom by Eric Fromm.
Yes, sir.
From
Yes,
the
sir.
Frankfurt School. He was from the Frankfurt School. Eric
Yeah.
Fromm, Fromm. And
Yeah.
he presents a picture where he says, what if there is no power relation in society at all? What if there is no control at all? So he says, humans tend to get scared when they're left on their own. They want someone to guide them, someone to always, so there cannot be, what he feels, and I also believe in certain ways where we cannot have a completely equal society, but what we can definitely have is a more humane society where power relations do exist, but they're not so stark that people die or people are killed, or there would be some form of inequality, yes, either in terms of one's ethnicity or in terms of class, in terms of income, education. These might still exist in the near future, but it should not be so stark that that people lose lives, or we would all know that in India, for instance, the top 5% or 10% maximum, they own 90% of all the resources. And there's a gross disparity between the haves and the have-nots, and it's still increasing. We are having more billionaires, coming up. And so when will it change? I'm not really sure, but doing research definitely helps because it informs people. Now, the issue really here, I feel, is when we are writing as academics, we are only writing to the academic audience. We are not actually taking it to the masses. Can we do that?
No, we have to take it up. For example, you rightly pointed out from Eric Fromm's writing, and also I would like to the Brazilian professor, the pedagogy of the oppressed.
Okay. Yeah.
Now that means, we are following that pedagogy of the oppressed. Are we still using that word oppressed?
Yes.
When are we going to come out of that?
Yes. No, I am not really sure. But what I would like to suggest here is we are all attempting to do so. We are all at least acknowledging the fact, because earlier we were not even acknowledging this. Now at least we are acknowledging the fact that there are those who are at the bottom end of, whether it be queer rights, for instance, there are all kinds of agitations for that. Dalit agitation, feminist movements, all kinds of things are happening today. Yes. And I'm quite hopeful that in the near future, there would be, these disparities would not be so stark. But when, I would not be able to really say. I'm not that qualified. I'm so sorry. But I would
Okay,
definitely
yeah.
say that we would like to take, we should we should not keep knowledge production only within the academia. It should go out
Yes, sir.
into social movements, into whatever, etc., into different realms. Because the academia also borrows, for instance, the feminist movement and feminist methodology comes from outside. It does not come from the academia. It comes from the women's
Yes, sir.
movement or civil rights movements that took place in the US, for instance. So I think there should be a give and take, and it should become more. I mean, we should write more, and when we write for the masses, our language also should be diluted in such a way that they understand what we are saying.
Okay, sir.
Because
My last clarification would be, will there be any possibility of requesting or even informing the constitutional makers to have some kind of an effect, to have an equity among our citizens? See, they say black is beautiful, but blacks are even now harassed on the
Correct.
streets. They are
Correct.
shot. Yes, sir. So what best can be done? Can we politically move something so that there will be proper equity in the world?
Difficult question again, because these are all power relations embedded
Yeah.
in various fields. But yes, what we can do is we can still contest wherever we are. So if I'm in the academia, what can I use? What are the resources that I have? So I can contest it. I can contest it through knowledge production. If I'm in the political field, I'll try and contest it in the parliament or wherever possible. If I am in business, I would try and reduce the monopoly of certain kinds of coterie, for instance. If I'm in some other field, I'll try and, if I'm a journalist, I'll try and. So I think if all of us work towards it, there
Yes,
is a
sir.
possibility
Yes, sir.
that I think we should be honest with what we do in our own fields. We don't need to get out of our field and say I'll go and do some political advocacy. Why? You can do it through your own knowledge generation, for instance, as an academic. So I think we have choices, but I'm not really sure how effective they are. But we need to move towards these collective ways of action in various formats and from various spaces, from various locations.
Thank you very much, sir, for your clarification.
Thank you.
We
Thank you so
still
much.
go on fighting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sir, I'm Dr. Vandana. So
Yes.
I have a small doubt, which I don't know that whether it may be called as a doubt or not. So a small clarification.
Sure, ma'am.
So, sir, actually the thing is that while we are writing the things, articles and all the things, we are reflecting the ideas. So
Correct.
that is from the third person's perspective. Like we have to be from subjectivity, we have to come out of that one, and rationally or objectivity we have to use, and we have to write that on.
Correct.
So now, when there is things which is like coming out, which is autoethnography, whereas like reflective ethnography. So whereas like autoethnography is there, so how, if I myself is reflecting, so how far one can come across the, could you give some glimpses on the how a person can make these things better? So that is one question I have. And followed by that, I would like to know one more thing, which is while the Gure, where we were reading, the Gure, whereas like the father of sociology, we are reading that every person will start with the Gure. So G.S. Gure, and later we are followed by, currently when I do teach in CMR University. So whereas like now when I'm teaching along with Gure, when I'm teaching the Gure, I also say about the Karol Upadhyay, how she also look into the idea, how it has been criticized. So now the
Correct.
same thing which has been once it was made as a theory, now it has been out of the like when the period goes over, it has been replaced or rethinking from a different perspective.
Correct.
So now we can say that it is an improved version or like looking from a different perspective. But as a sociologist or a theorist, how you look, because it's like that theory which is again deconstructing or looking from a different perspective. So
Okay.
how do you look towards that? So I
Okay.
have two questions.
I think both these questions, Dr. Vandana, that you posed are very interesting, very critical, really. Coming to the first question, where you say generally we write in third person. And what do we do when we are writing an autobiography or some narrative or, say, of sufferings that one has actually gone through or perceived, or is writing in first person of the part of the of the uh, 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 informant, for instance, and you want to actually present what he or she says. So you would see that in many of the works we have something called quote. We put it in a particular format, and we actually use verbatim what that person has actually said. And this provides that space to explain, for instance, even in my slide, I've used Bourdieu's quote, for instance, where I'm trying to tell you what he himself has said without mixing my ideas, but I'm also interpreting what I think what Bourdieu has said. So there's a difference of what actually Bourdieu said and what I might have interpreted and how I'm presenting it. But I'll try and minimize it in certain ways through the kind of knowledge or training that I get in terms of understanding Bourdieu, for instance. So when you write a paper, for instance, or when you publish, you also have a choice of not always writing in the third person uh, voice. You can also write it in the first person's voice, especially like I mentioned, when you are talking about feminist methodologies and feminist, kinds of narratives, where they actually present, because feminist methodology does tell us that we should, in many ways, suspend, as a researcher, you must suspend your so-called knowledge systems that you have internalized until now, that you are an expert sociologist or whatever, social scientist. You must suspend that and you must listen to what the other person is saying, because the other person is the expert at that point of time and is explaining the world that they have experienced and the world as they see it. And I think you can, when you're writing this, it does come out in the feminist methodology, where you actually present it in the first person narrative also, the first person category also. And coming to the second question, you did mention how we have theories. So for instance, G.S. Ghure's work, and later you have many other sociologists, Carol Upadhyay, for instance, you have so many other scholars who actually critique G.S. Ghure's work, and later even Carol Upadhyay's work is critiqued, and there are new theorizations, for instance. So the idea is that as we engage with new knowledge systems, as we create new knowledge, we have more arsenal through which we can re-look at and interpret what has happened. So, for instance, Ghure, sorry. So, for instance, Ghure, basically, if you know the historical background, Ghure was trained in the UK, and he was seen to be more of an anthropologist. And if you read, something on, and I'm sure you must have, on doing sociology in India, you must have read that, there was this whole difference between how anthropology was viewed and how sociology was used. Because Europe thought it was the center of the world, and it was modern, and therefore it looked at the rest of the world as uncivilized and primitive, and therefore it thought that there should be a discipline that should study the uncivilized or the primitive, and therefore anthropology was created. And sociology was meant only for the developed, so-called, or modern worlds. And therefore, Gore was trained in basically anthropology and to look at, and therefore, if you look at his work, it is on caste, race, so much so that it reflects and it takes in a lot of the ideas also. It is Indological also. He was also very well versed in Sanskrit, for instance, if you know this. But it follows the accepted Eurocentric model. He even took anthropometric measures, in terms of how race and caste are related, etc., etc. And which later, of course, we know are redundant frameworks. I mean, his own student, his two students, rejected his theories. One very famous, both famous. One, of course, is M.N. Srinivas, who actually, started something called the field work. And he said, the Varna model of understanding this, textual form of caste is completely defunct. You have to have a new way of looking at it through the Jati system. And the other, of course, was A.R. Desai, who was a Marxist and who looked at caste very, very differently in terms of how materiality is embedded in caste relations, for instance. So I think, everyone has to be critiqued. Even Bourdieu, for instance, is critiqued in his own way. And we move forward. And this is how I think knowledge is produced and reproduced, and in new ways and new perspectives come in. So there is nothing ultimate about anything. There is nothing which is final. It is all ever changing, and things are always, newly created. I hope I've been able to answer your question, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. But I have small clarification on the first question. Whereas,
Yes.
like you have mentioned about we can use the personal narratives and all the things, and
Yes.
way of using the feminist methodology and all the things. So, how we can come out of the biases. Suppose I am working in a corporate institute, whereas if I am writing about the employee or the employee mechanism happening inside that one. So whereas I'll be reflecting my own experiences, everyday experiences. That is how I'll be looking to that one, and I'll be introspecting that one, and I'll be coming out of that as an autoethnography. So while writing that one, whereas when I am using my everyday practices, everyday interactions, how I look towards that. So there are chances between that. If when I write that thing, there are chances of me to get biased. At the same time, I have to use the personal narratives as within this one, and to make that what is things are happening inside that to the outer world. So
Yeah,
how can I bridge that one?
Okay, I get your point. Now the issue
Thank
here
you so
is
much, sir.
the issue here is what you're saying is, if one were to express one's experiences, but as social scientists, we do not just narrate the experiences as they are, not in vacuum. There is nothing that can happen in vacuum. So we are expressing whatever experiences we have vis-a-vis a certain theoretical framework. We are saying, this is happening to me, and you're reflecting and saying, why is this happening to me? Why not to someone else? If this is happening to me, why is it happening in such a fashion? What is it that, is it my location that is affecting the way I'm perceiving the world? And this is exactly what is called reflexivity. And so you use your own experience, but you see it through a reflexive lens to understand why it is happening to you or to someone, or contextualize it. And but it does not mean that despite doing all this, it does not mean that when you reach a particular conclusion that it is completely unbiased, because there are certain biases that you cannot completely remove. So in social sciences, we cannot talk about absolutism, because there is nothing absolute in the social world. Not only in the social world, actually, even in sciences, for instance, now they believe that there is nothing absolute, because the concept of absolute itself is anomaly in sciences. So it has to be always in comparison with something. It has to be always relative to something. So you cannot have absoluteness anywhere, and definitely not in social sciences. So yes, your own experiences, your own narratives, your own autobiography, but seen through a lens of social theory, would allow you to be reflective. And despite all this, when you write all that, there would be certain biases that inevitably form part of your writing, which you cannot completely do away with. It is part of your habitus. It is part of your unconscious. It is part of something that is already there, which you cannot completely get rid of.
Thank you
I
so
hope
much.
I've been.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any other questions anyone has? I can wrap up the session.
So if there is no questions now, shall we wind up the session? So before coming to the final vote of thanks, these discussions are very fruitful. And one thing I would like to comment upon from the Professor Joseph Dunstan's comments, that our perspective, especially the sociological or social science perspective, from writing, Professor Vishal Jadhav has highly pointed out the perspective which may vary from the writing is vary from a different context, especially subaltern perspective, Dalit perspective, feminist methodology, and like a social movement perspective. That itself is yes, very clear. In each perspective we are writing, accordingly, our focus should be there. But in general, this thing, we the sociologists, we are very particular about what it is. We are not focusing on what should be, what ought to be.
Correct.
And very important thing is, based on our research, we can give some input to the policy relevance. That is more important in that context. Our way of writing is value-free. We are not value-loaded. So in this context, I thank Professor Vishal Jadhav on behalf of RC03, on behalf of all the participants. I wholeheartedly thank for his wonderful or insightful lecture, which is on the reflexivity on the social science research writing, which is very informative to the participants.
Thank you so much, sir.
Jadhav. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you,
so
sir.
much.
Nice.
We'll meet sometime soon. Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.